Without further ado, I'd like to introduce your presenter to you today, the reason you came to the webinar. His name is Dr. Timothy Rasinski, and he's a professor of literacy education at Kent State University. He has written over 200 articles and has authored, co-authored, or edited over 20 books or curriculum programs on reading education. His scholarly interests include reading fluency and word study, reading the elementary and middle grades, and readers who struggle. Dr. Rasinski's research on reading has been cited by the National Reading Panel and has been published in journals such as Reading Research Quarterly, The Reading Teacher, Reading Psychology, and the Journal of Educational Research. Please help me welcome Dr. Timothy Rasinski.
Thanks, Carrie, and thank you everyone out there for spending the next hour or so with me. Today's topic is on literacy instruction, my specialty, but looking particularly at kids who struggle and of course, our ELL students. If you ever heard me speak before, you know that I usually use what I call a bridge model for talking about literacy and what's important when it comes to literacy. This model, the most important part of the model is at the bottom of the page, where we know that comprehension, or what I call the deep level of meaning, is the goal of reading. But to get to comprehension, we have learned that there are certain competencies that students need to acquire. One is word knowledge, and the other one is reading fluency, the two key critical elements. And what I'd like to do today is basically use this bridge as a guide for what we're going to be covering today. First, talking about word knowledge, developing that in students, and moving on to reading fluency. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about comprehension and do all that in less than 60 minutes. That's going to be some bit of a challenge. I'd like to start first of all with words and vocabulary. Some of the things we know about words. We know that vocabulary knowledge is strongly associated with reading comprehension and overall reading proficiency. We've known that for 50 or more years there. We also know that the English corpus or lexicon of words is large and continues to grow every single year. We'd also know that kids need to know a lot of words. Some of the estimates I have read indicate that children need to learn at least 1,000 words per year. And you know, that's a lot. If you divide 1,000 by 36 weeks in the school year, you're talking about a lot of words per week. And we also know, sadly, that our students' growth in vocabulary has been relatively stagnant for the past 20 years. In fact, we wonder if perhaps that's the reason why our reading scores have been stagnant also for the same time period. Here's an article from the Wall Street Journal just a year or so ago that talked about how these tests that our students are given on vocabulary do not show any improvements over time, which is disturbing given the fact that the number of words in English continues to grow. So, what is the best way to teach vocabulary? Does anybody know? I certainly don't, but I do know the worst. I absolutely know the worst way. I hope that sadly, probably we all can relate to this. This is my son Michael, who when he was in 5th grade was in a talented and gifted class in his school. And so being that talented and gifted child, he didn't get 20 words a week like his classmates. He got 50, sometimes even 60, but it was the same sort of assignment. He had to look these words up in a dictionary, memorize the spelling and the definition, took the test on Friday, got an A or a B on it, and had them forgotten by the following Monday. Not only are there too many words on this list, they're actually really quite hard and difficult. Take a look at some of these words: restive, reverie, roseate, rueful, sallow. Folks, you know, I don't even know what some of those words mean, and just because a word's hard doesn't mean it's worth teaching. So that it's well-meaning. I'm not going to dispute that, but it's not a terribly effective way. What I'd like to do today is share with you some strategies that I know work, and especially if we're talking about those children for whom English is not their first language. I'm going to talk about 4 specific things. I have more, but I was trying to keep this under an hour. I call them noticing words, using figurative language, and you can see where that's a big one for our ELL kids. Word games, and cognates or word patterns. So let's begin with a quote. This is an old professor of mine from the University of Nebraska, Don Cushenberry, and he was noted for saying this. He said, "Teaching is the process of making visible that which is normally invisible." You know, as the things that our students don't notice, that's our job as teachers is to help our kids notice those things. And if you think about it, if you read a book, any text that's published for that matter, most of us, we are reading for the story, to be satisfied by the story, but do we often notice the words that the author has included? Because by the very nature of being published, these authors have probably very likely used interesting words that are worth studying. I'll give you an example here of Julius, the Baby of the World. Wonderful, wonderful story by Kevin Henkes. It's most appropriate for, I'd say, kindergarten, first or second graders, but not if you look at the words. Take a look. I'm going to read to you the first couple pages of Julius, the Baby of the World, and see if there's any interesting words that you might want to harvest. That's what we call harvest, pulling out of context. Before Julius was born, Lily was the best big sister in the world. She gave him things, she told him secrets, and she sang lullabies to him every night. After Julius was born, it was a different story. Lily took her things back, she pinched his tail, and she yelled insulting comments into his crib. "I am the queen," said Lily, "and I hate Julius." But her parents loved him. They kissed his wet pink nose, they admired his small black eyes, and they stroked his sweet white fur. Lily thought his wet pink nose was slimy. She thought his small black eyes were beady, and she thought his sweet white fur was not so sweet, especially when he needed his diaper changed. "Julius is the baby of the world," chimed Lily's parents. "Disgusting," said Lily. All right, it's a great story, and you can see where the conflict is already developing here. But as somebody who's a lexophile like me, did you notice any of the interesting words? Well, let's go back to the beginning, and let's look at some of the pages. The first page we see is lullabies. Now, children probably know what a lullaby is, but I would tell you that probably many children have not really experienced that word. And again, maybe our struggling readers or our ELL kids. Let's move on to the next page. Insulting comments. When was the last time you heard a first or second grader use that kind of language? And yet, kids don't have any trouble understanding the words because of that rich context that Kevin Henkes puts these words in. Admired and stroked are certainly key words and interesting words that would certainly be build vocabulary. And finally, let's go to the last page that I read to you. Slimy, beady, chimed, disgusting. These are wonderful words that we have to help our children notice. So what we do, the teachers I work with, we call it harvesting words. The children would call out some of these interesting words at the end of the read aloud, and well, we would put them on a word wall. We talk about the meaning to the words. We'd encourage our kids to use these words in their own oral and written language. In fact, if you'd want your students to use these words, you would have to use them yourself because they are literary words. They're not words that we use that much as adults. So you might say to your students how much you admire their work and stroke their egos there, and certainly have fun with that sort of wordplay with our students there. Now, there are 9 words on my word wall here. Imagine if you read to your students every single day and you harvested 9 words. Let's do the math. 9 words per day times 180 school days. Well, this isn't a math webinar, but I can tell you it's well over 1,000 words. Isabel Beck endorses this approach. So does Camille Blackowitz, 2 of our leading experts in the area of vocabulary. Say this is a terrific way. Harvesting words, getting our kids to notice these words. Let's move on to another kind of word or phrase that many of our students struggle with, our ELL kids in particular, figurative language, in particular idiomatic expressions. It's raining cats and dogs. The problem, as we all know, is that these words are not meant to be taken literally. They're metaphors. They mean something else. It's raining cats and dogs. It's coming down really hard, and I hope those of you in California will soon be experiencing that rain coming down. Going back to the drawing board, having to start all over because what you had originally planned didn't work out. Every cloud has a silver lining. Again, the meaning here is that look for the good in even things that might not be so good. So they're difficult, of course, because they have that metaphorical nature. But they're also important because authors use figurative language a lot in their own writing. That's what makes their writing so good. So how do we teach idioms and figurative language? Well, one way I have found that's pretty interesting is helping kids notice them by themes rather than making a list of alphabetical idioms. How about doing it by different themes? Now, what you're seeing on my my PowerPoint are some of the themes I've used: dogs and cats, ducks, food, baseball, and so on and so forth. You know, let's think. Can you think of any dog expressions? His bark was worse than his bite. Have you ever barked up the wrong tree? Have you ever been in the doghouse? Did anybody ever throw you a bone? Or how about let sleeping dogs lie? All of those have a meaning that go beyond the literal level. But putting them all together gives our students a chance to play with them in a sense. You know, we're here in September, and baseball season is just about over. We're getting into the playoffs, and one of my favorite sets of idioms are baseball idioms. You know any? I'm going to give you about 5 seconds and see if you can come up with an expression or two that has something to do with baseball, but goes beyond baseball. Let's see if anybody out there here can hit a home run, as they might say in baseball. Well, I hope you came up with some, because there's a lot out there. Anybody ever play hardball with you? Anybody ever throw you a curve, a little deceptive? Better keep your eye on the ball. Pay attention. 3 strikes and you're out. Teachers use that one a lot. So you can see all of these: hit a home run, struck out, not doing so well, and of course there's that one you never want to use with students about going on a date and making it past first base. I'll just pass on that one. But it's fun to group them in that sort of way. And then again, putting them on display for our students, 5 or 6 of these around a particular theme. And then they're up there so that students can use them in their oral and written language. A student gives you a great answer, and you say, "Oh, you just hit a home run with that one," right? That sort of thing. And of course, we can encourage our kids to use these idiomatic expressions in their own oral and mostly in their written language. This is an example you're seeing of a teacher who, I think they were 5th grade. They had their students reading a 5th grade version of Romeo and Juliet, and then the teacher asked them to write a summary of it, but use as many of your sports idioms, not just baseball, but sports idioms as possible. And I really find this incredibly clever, and to me it's a twofer, because this one assignment actually captures 2 different critical variables. Number one, the writing the summary is a great comprehension activity, but also the use of these idiomatic expressions builds good kids' vocabulary for their own writing. Have you ever seen a writing rubric that doesn't include word choice? This is a great way of improving their writing as well. So that idea of thematic collections of idioms, and I'd like to share with you 2 of my favorite resources. You'll get this, as Carrie said, at the end of the session, the PDF file of this, but Lorraine Leedy's book is a terrific one. There's a Frog in My Throat, collection of idioms related all about different kinds of animals. And then a website, idiomconnection.com, which is a collection of idiomatic expressions, but this time it goes beyond animals, and it tells you what the expressions mean. And of course, I had to get a little bit of myself into this. I had an opportunity to write a couple of books about idioms and English expressions, and the nice thing about this, we included short passages that students could read as that included these expressions. So it wasn't just in isolation all the time here. Let's move on to word games. How many of you raise your hand if you play word games? This is one you're looking at. My wife and I do it quite often. It's in our local newspaper, and I'm sure many of you have the same thing in your paper. The author gives you a word, in this case Jasmine. You have 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and your job is to think as many words as you can that can be made from those letters. My wife and I challenge each other there with the activity, and it's a lot of fun to do. It's a fun activity, but think of all those games that we play that are word games. Not only this, but also Scrabble, Boggle, Balderdash. Well, I would like to share with you a word game that I'm going to at least take partial credit for. It's called Word Ladders. It's a kind of game that involves the manipulation of words or letters to make different words there. I share this with you because I've received comments from emails from my colleagues in China who have used these word ladders to teach English vocabulary to Chinese children. It's interesting how these things get around here. But here's one I'm going to take you back to last April and share it with you. We're going to start with the word planet. And what we're going to do is make a series of words, adding, subtracting, changing, rearranging the letters. So here we go. Take away one letter from planet, a celestial object that orbits our sun, and make a word that is a vehicle that flies in the sky. Now, I'm sure that all of you know that that next word would be plane. All right, so now what we're going to do is go through a series of these words, take a letter away from plane and make a word that means to prepare, plan. Take away another letter to make something you fry fish in, pan. Change a letter in pan to make another word for being able to do something, I am able or I can. Change a letter, make the word car. Add a letter to make the word care. Change a letter to make a wild rabbit, a hare. Rearrange the letters to make something you do with your ear, you hear. Add a letter to make something my cardiologist checks on me every year, my heart. And add a letter to heart to make a fancy fireplace, a hearth. And then we take away one letter, and we make a word that goes with the first word, earth, planet to earth. This was an activity we did back in April around Earth Day with our students, and it was a fun little activity. When I do these word ladders, the first and last words go together. But you notice, take a look at those words there. Some of them are pretty challenging words. Hearth, many of our students would not know that word. Or the word pan, P-A-N. I might tell kids that word pan is a Greek word, and it means everything, like a panoramic view. You can see everything. A pandemic is where everybody gets sick and so on. Again, I hate to be commercial, but I did happen to write a few books on these word ladders. And the way they actually look, if you were to actually buy the program, they look like this sheet here, where you go up the word ladder. In this particular case, students start with the word ship at the bottom there, and then they work their way up, and the last word is a group of ships or a fleet there. But people have often told me that these look like a crossword puzzle for kids, where you have, for every word you make, there's a clue, and a number of letters are given to you for that word, and the words are interlocked with each other, much like in a crossword puzzle. And I've been told that people who do crossword puzzles often usually have really quite sophisticated vocabularies, and at the same time are actually pretty good readers as well. So think about the games that we play. This is simply one, but there's many others that are out there. So we talked about noticing words, we talked about games, we talked about idiomatic expressions, and I'm going to end my talk on words with cognates or morphemes, or better yet, roots, word roots. English is in a language that borrows heavily from other languages, and arguably the two most important languages that English has borrowed from are Latin and Greek. And because of that, especially because of our academic vocabulary, most of our academic words in English are derived from Latin and Greek. And the neat thing about these roots is the generative nature of these roots. If you know what one of these roots mean, it can help you with 5, 10, 15, in some cases over 100 words. There are those of you who ever took a Latin or Greek in high school or college. I think you make that connection. Well, again, let me share with you how this might be done. Again, helping our kids notice these roots there. Going back to our Earth Day example back in April, we celebrated Earth Day not only by planet Earth word ladder, but we exposed kids to the terra root, which is the Latin word for earth or land. Knowing that, then, what we did was we saw if we could come up with other words that in English that have that root in them. And here's just a sampling. A terrace, when you flatten out the land on a hill, you terrace it because you don't want erosion. You flatten it out. Terrain, the lay of the land. Territory. Before California was a state, it was a territory belonging to the United States of America. Terra Cotta, ask the art teacher if you don't know what that one means. Subterranean, extraterrestrial, even Mediterranean. The middle of the earth, the Romans thought that big sea was there, the Mediterranean. and even Terranova. The reason I put Terranova down there was because when Columbus Day is coming up here in a few weeks, and well, I'm told when he wrote in his journal when they finally landed on San Salvador, that's what he called it. We made it to Terranova, the new Earth there. And then what we do is we, again, make these words noticeable. We put them on display for students. This is a 5th grade classroom where the teacher taught the kids 2 roots, before and after. Ante means before, and post means after. And look at all the words that you can come up with here. Anterior, antebellum, the period before the Civil War, antecedent, antecessor, and of course all the post words there. When you go to the Italian restaurant and you get the antepasta, when is it usually served? It's usually served before the main meal, before the pasta. Hence the note, hence the term ante. Interestingly enough, though, most restaurants spell it anti-pasta, which I point out as often as I can whenever I go to a restaurant. Once it got me a free dinner, and the other time I was asked to leave the restaurant. But you've got to go for whatever, do whatever you can here. Now, some people think, well, these roots, yeah, it's a pretty good idea, Rasinski, but it's only for older kids, high schoolers, maybe middle schoolers. And I say, we can teach these all the way down to 1st grade. What you're looking at here is a 1st grader, Akron, Ohio. They were learning the prefixes, the numerical prefixes, UNI, BI, TRI. Now, this young man has a little bit of trouble with the spelling of try, TRI, but he certainly knows the concept, because he knows that when you put try with cycle, you get 3 wheels. And try with athlete, you get 3 sports. And try with pod, you get 3 legs. This guy's got it down. Do you think this is going to help him when he gets into the later grades and comes across other words that have try in them, like the tricolored flag of France and so on? We are learning more and more that this is a great way of building vocabulary. In fact, the New York Times a few years ago asked, what are some ways to build our vocabulary? And right at the top of the list was Greek and Latin roots. My colleagues and I have been studying this. We've actually written about it. There is a book called What Research Has to Say About Vocabulary Instruction by the International Reading Association, and myself and 3 other colleagues wrote the introductory chapter to this. In fact, we've gotten on this bandwagon so much we actually wrote a book about Greek and Latin roots, keys to building vocabulary. I truly think, I've seen this in action, and I truly think that this can be a game changer. Think of your students, especially those ones who are Spanish speakers. Spanish is a Latin-based language as well as French and many other of the what we call Romance languages. This can be a wonderful bridge for those children who can see that agua means water in Spanish, and a very similar word, aqua, means water in English. So those are some great ways of thinking about words and word knowledge, building it with our kids, but that's not enough. We also have to work on reading fluency. And 2 particular points of fluency. One is this components of fluency, I guess I should say. One is this thing called automaticity and word recognition. Automaticity means we want our students to be able to recognize words so effortlessly that they really don't pay attention to sounding out the words or the meaning to the words. What they're really paying attention to is the meaning that the author is trying to convey through the text. And you can only do that when you automatically recognize words. And then we also want to work on prosody or expressiveness. We know that readers who, when they read orally, read with good expression. When they read silently, they tend to comprehend text better because they even have that internal listening device where they hear themselves. So we want to work on both automaticity and prosody. And how do you do that? Well, there are several components, but I'd like to highlight 2. One is what I call assisted reading, and the other one's what I call deep or repeated reading. These are 2 simple things that can make a huge difference. And again, going back to our ELL students, we know from the work of the National Reading Panel that examine what ELL students need. They said right up front, fluency, of course, is an issue. So assisted reading, what is that? Assisted reading is nothing more than reading a text while at the same time hearing it read to you in a fluent, expressive manner. If I'm not a good reader and I'm reading a text as best I can, but at the same time I'm hearing somebody read it with me, in that expressive, meaningful way, I will eventually get to the point where I can read like them, and not only on that text, but others as well. That's what assisted reading is. And while there's various forms of assisted reading, the most common form is choral reading, reading as a group. And of course, those of you who are primary grade teachers, it's a no-brainer. You do that all the time. But we've been finding some research coming out about middle school kids doing choral reading and having great impact on their reading and their comprehension. But you could read with a partner. That could be a parent, a teacher, a classroom aide, even a classmate, somebody who's just a slightly better reader than you. If you were to spend 10 minutes reading in this partner way, paired way, again, you would be improving your fluency and your comprehension because you're traveling that road down to comprehension. And in fact, recorded reading. Do you ever read something and while listening to a recorded version of it? Again, the research on this is really quite extensive and quite convincing. Here, and I'll just put in a plug for Reading Assistant, which is made by the sponsor of today's webinar. They have a program called Reading Assistant that actually provides that with our students. So these are forms. Reading something and hearing it read to you at the same time, that's assisted reading. Let's move on to repeated reading, or what I have also called deep reading. It's simply reading a text multiple times until it can be read fluently. Much like the analogy I often use is athletes or musicians who will practice whatever it is they're trying to master several times through, because once through does not achieve mastery. They have to rehearse several times, or they have to do a certain number of reps. And what the research tells us in reading, this multiple reading, it can be, again, for kids who are not as fluent as they need to be, can really make a difference. I'm going to share with you a summary of the research that has been done on repeated reading. That letter A there at the top of the page, or at the top of the chart there, it represents a text that we're asking kids to read. So we'll ask the children to read this text 1, 2, 3, 4 times. And as this chart suggests, with every reading, the students get better. They improve in terms of fluency, more expressiveness, they read with better accuracy, and of course comprehension. But you'd expect that to happen. You practice something, you get better at it. It's what happens next. They move on to passage B, and B is more challenging than A. It's a harder text. So ostensibly, we should expect their performance on B to be worse than A. But as my chart shows here, the red line, their performance on B is actually better than A. How could that be? B was harder than A. Well, the only thing they did between the first reading of A and the first reading of B was they practiced A. So the only thing that you can logically attribute that growth in B was to practice in A. And then, of course, we'll move on to the next passage, C. C is harder than A and B, and yet, again, what we see is growth. So the practice of one text not only improves the reading of that one text, but it also leads to improvements on new passages you've never seen before. Much like a musician, or those of you who've ever taken music lessons, you know that you practice one piece and you get to perform it pretty well, but then you move on to the next one and you find improvement in that as well. The same thing in reading as well. The challenge, though, is how do you actually get students to practice a text, reading it 3, 4, 5 times? And I'll answer my own question. What I find is the most natural and authentic way of doing repeated readings is performance. Performance. If you've ever been in a play or sang a song for an audience or recited a poem, you had to rehearse. And if you didn't, you probably wish you had, because we get up there with a little nervous and it doesn't come out quite as good as we hoped it would be there. But performance, I'll give you a quick example right now. This presentation that I'm giving to you right now, I think I must have gone through it about 10, 12 times in the last 2 or 3 days there. And the reason is I want to do a good job. I hope when we end this webinar in 10 or 15 minutes or so, you can say, oh, I understand some of that vocabulary or fluency stuff a little bit better. If there's some degree of satisfaction on your part, then that rehearsal on my part or the repeated practice was worth it. Well, that leads me to the next question. Are there certain texts that are meant to be performed? And of course there are. If you look at this list here that I put in, it's an incomplete list, but if you look at it, it brings back memories to me. When I was a child in school, we used to recite poetry all the time. We used to sing songs all the time, always with the words in front of us. We used to put on plays, readers' theater scripts. We used to have to learn speeches from American history, almost to the point of memorization. And how do you do that? You have to practice repeatedly over and over again. So these are the kinds of texts that I think we need to bring in, and we don't see nearly as much of this in our reading programs as perhaps we did in previous years. Their poetry has been called the neglected genre of our reading programs. You don't see songs hardly at all anymore, maybe in some programs, but again, I would argue that they have been replaced by informational text and stories. And I'm not going to disagree that informational text and stories aren't important, but that's no reason to leave these out. When kids read this material, they have to rehearse, and rehearsal is authentic, repeated readings there. Well, if you want to learn more about fluency and repeated readings and assisted reading, I'd like to say I wrote the book on it. However, I'm not going to brag that much. I'll just say I wrote a book about and it's called The Fluent Reader. It goes into quite good detail about reading fluency and how it could be taught in this authentic sort of way here. Finally, and I apologize if I'm going too fast. I'm a person who tends to talk fast, but I wanted to get through as much as possible. Comprehension, the promised land, if you will, that deep level of processing. How do we do that? How do we help our kids with that? Because, one of the things we know about our struggling readers and our ELL readers is, they comprehend, but oftentimes it's more in that superficial, literal way. How do we get them into that deeper level of comprehension, or what the Common Core state standards here in the United States have called close reading? How do we do that? And I'd like to explore that with you, if I could, in the last part of our session here. People have been writing about close reading over the last several years now. What does it mean? And I'm going to share with you three scholars who have written about it. Nancy Boyles is a scholar who wrote an article in Ed Leadership about this. She wrote that, defines it as uncovering layers of meaning. Uncovering layers of meaning. Now, not sure about you, but what do you have to do when you uncover a layer? Whether you're peeling an onion or going to deeper levels on a text, you have to go back to it over and over again. So there's that idea of going back and reading something more than once. Grant Wiggins wrote about disciplined rereading, rereading with a purpose, not just rereading because the teacher told me to read this 3 times, but real rereading. And then, of course, Tim Shanahan, one of the authors of the National Reading Panel report, says that because challenging texts do not give up their meanings easily, it is essential that readers reread such texts. So in all 3 of these definitions, I hear the notion of rereadings. And isn't that interesting, because what did we just cover a few minutes ago when we talked about fluency? Rereadings, reading something several times through. So rereading is not just an activity for building fluency, but ostensibly it gives us a chance to allow our kids to get into those deeper levels of meaning, pulling away those layers of meaning to get to that deep structure. But how do you do that? How do you engage kids in this close, disciplined rereading, if you will? Well, I think the answer is we give them different purposes for rereading. Think about yourself, those of you who might be taking a graduate class right now, and perhaps you were assigned a chapter out of the textbook. Well, you probably read that chapter last week because you were going to talk about it in class in a discussion. But you might go back to that chapter and read it again because, well, that information is going to be on the final 15 weeks from now. And you might go back and reread it another time because, well, you're doing a term project that's required, and you want to go back and make sure that you understand exactly what the author was trying to say about that particular topic. So there you go, 3 rereadings on one passage for different reasons. But there you go. That's you were doing close reading. Well, here's some quick examples I brought with me here. We can ask students to look for the main ideas or themes in a text. We could ask kids to ask questions why. Why did individuals act in a particular way? Why did events work out in a certain way? You sort of get at the motivation. The third one there, identify and interpret words and phrases. Hey, there's that notion of harvesting words again. Are there any interesting words? Well, you have to go back to the passage and look it over again. Look at the structure of the text. Is it written as a poem? Is it written as an informational text? Is it written as a story? Or you might want to look at point of view. Who's telling the story and why? And of course, one of my favorites is the idea of transforming a text into a new form. Take a story and turn it into a reader's theater script, or turn it into a poem, or write it as a monologue or an interview. Every one of these approaches gets our students to go back into that text and read it again from a different angle. And that's what close reading, at least my interpretation of close reading, is, to dig deep for meaning here. Here's a quick example. One of my favorite authors is Arnold Lobel, and one of my favorite stories is his Frog and Toad series. It comes from Spring by Arnold Lobel, and it's about Toad. He's asleep, and Frog, his best friend, wants to wake him up so that they can go out and play. Well, let me read to you just a section of this, and then we'll talk about close reading of this simple text here. "But Toad," cried Frog, "you will miss all the fun." "Listen, Frog," said Toad, "how long have I been asleep?" "Oh, you have been asleep since November," said Frog. "Well then," said Toad, "a little more sleep will not hurt me. Come back again and wake me up at about 1/2 May. Good night, Frog." "But Toad," said Frog, "I will be lonely until then." Toad did not answer. He had fallen asleep. Frog looked at Toad's calendar. The November page was still on top. Frog tore off the November page. He tore off the December page and the January page and the February page and the March page. He came to the April page. Frog tore off the April page too. Then Frog ran back to Toad's bed. Toad, wake up. It's May now." "What?" said Toad. "Can it be May so soon?" "Yes," said Frog. "Look at your calendar." Toad looked at his calendar. The May frog was on top. "Why, it is May," said Toad as he climbed out of his bed. Then he and Frog ran outside to see how the world was looking in the spring. I got a feeling that if it was November, he's going to be in it for a bit of a surprise. Great, great story by Frog and Toad. First graders love it. Kindergartners love these stories. Even second graders, and I'll be honest with you, even adults do as well. But how can we get our students to read this a little closely? Yes, we can. We just need to give them different reasons to look at it. So we could, talk about motivation. Why did Frog try to wake Toad? Was he selfless or selfish by doing so? Getting that I give motivation there. How did Frog eventually get Toad to wake him up? What was his plan? Did he trick him? There's kind of a literal meaning there. Why didn't other attempts work to rouse Toad? So now we get into evaluation. What convinced Toad? Again, looking at motivation there. And again, we could actually go beyond the text. Is Frog being a good friend here? Is Toad? Again, look at the text and connect it to your own idea of what a good friend does, and be able to discuss that. But you'll have to go back to the text. And do real friends trick their friends? And if so, why? Again, going back to our own experience there. We could keep going and ask questions like, why did Mr. Lobel write this story? What questions would you like to ask Mr. Lobel? Again, can you imagine coming up with questions without going back to the text and seeing what you'd like to ask about? Again, harvesting words. What interesting words or phrases can you find in the text? And then finally, as I said before, one of my favorites is to turn this particular section into a reader's theater script or a poem or a song. What other information might you include in the dialogue between Frog and Toad when you did that? Would you add other characters? And, when you would do something like that, basically what you're doing is you're inferring, you're making educated guesses about additional information there. That's high-level thinking on the part of our students. And I can tell you for a fact that I have worked with students, and I know teachers who have taken Frog and Toad and turned it into a reader's theater script, which then got rehearsed and performed. So we're building fluency at the same time as we're doing that close reading. But it's not just narrative or stories. We could do informational text. Thanksgiving is right around the corner here. For those of you in Canada, I believe it's October, and for us here in the States, it's in November. This is a text about Thanksgiving and why that one bird, why that one turkey is is spared every year. Well, and of course, the story goes back to Abraham Lincoln, who in 1865, his son wanted a turkey as a pet, and of course, because of that, he spared the life of one of the birds, and a tradition was born that lasts to this day here in America. Okay, it's simple. It's a simple text and get some good information there. But again, what could we do to help our students go back and pull away the layers of meaning? Why did the author write this? What was his or her intention? Why do we spare a turkey every year? What's the reason for that? Here's one that I found kind of interesting, and this would really challenge a student to think deeply. How is what President Lincoln's doing, sparing the life of a turkey here, how is that a metaphor for other things that were happening at the same time in American history? And of course, that would make the connection to the Civil War. That was a very deep analysis to be required to do that. But of course, we can actually get into more other forms of analysis as well. Suppose we ask students to create a TV interview between a reporter and the turkey who was spared. What did the turkey have to say about making it through till Thanksgiving Day and still being with us there? Or perhaps turning it and transforming it into a song, a simple song perhaps like Yankee Doodle. This is one that yours truly wrote a few days ago. It goes to the tune of Yankee Doodle. The lucky turkey went to town on the day before Thanksgiving, didn't meet his brother's fate, he's still among the living. You know, all right, I can't tell you that it's anything that is going to find its way onto YouTube or onto a music video, but I'll tell you something. For me to write that, I went back to the original text and I had to read it again. And in a sense, you know, that little song there is a form of is a brief summary of that text here. So again, the idea of close reading, that notion of rereading, is embedded in that idea of repeated reading, but we are embedded of close reading. But the idea is to find authentic ways and fun ways to do that. So that's our bridge. We need to develop word knowledge. We need to develop fluency. We need to develop comprehension. All three. All our students need these competencies, but in particular, and especially our ELL students and our struggling readers there. The takeaway simply is this: word study, fluency, comprehension, they're all important for reading success. Can't have one, can't have two, you got to have all three of them to be successful. And because of that, they all need to be addressed instructionally for our students there in ways that I think are engaging and fun and enjoyable for our students. So they're not like my son who had to memorize a set of words. They're more like children who can discover words in a text or reread a text because they're going to perform it there. So that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. I want to thank you for, I hope there's a few things there I might have reminded you of or shared with you that you might want to try with your students. But I'll open it up here in a second for questions, but I just want to tell you that our sponsor, Scientific Learning, has a couple of products that I hope you might want to take a look at. Fast Forward is really the top-rated intervention for English language learners, according to the What Works Clearinghouse of the United States Department of Education. It gives students individualized practice in grammar, academic vocabulary, word endings, and because kids get this intensive practice, which they need, especially our ELL kids, it allows them to make accelerated progress in reading. But then they have to transfer that knowledge to real reading, and that's where that reading assistant program comes in. It's a program where kids read, and the program actually listens to them read, and it gives them formative feedback. There are other programs that listen to kids read, but they'll give them that formative feedback that mold them into better readers. So I've had a chance to look at both these programs, and I would highly recommend that if you get a chance to take a look at them. Terry, I'm going to turn it back to you and see if there's any questions. I know we only have a few minutes left, but thank you all for attending the session with me, and well, I'll look for some questions from you. When you get your PDF file, the first slide has my email address on it, and if you have any questions or comments or thoughts or insights, please feel free to connect with me. I do promise that I get back to people. If you write to me, I'll definitely write back. Thanks, everyone.
Well, that was great. Thank you, Dr. Rasinski. I really enjoyed watching it as well. I really loved how you sung some stuff for us and really enjoyed it. So we did have a lot of questions that came in during the presentation, so I'm going to start with those questions, and then hopefully we'll get to everybody's questions. Let's see here. First question is about close reading, and if the student does do close reading, does student comprehension increase in your experience?
If it's done for the right reason. You know, some of these programs, some of you may be familiar with, I'm not going to name names, but students do repeated readings or rereadings, but the emphasis is on increasing their reading speed. And actually, what we have found is when we overemphasize speed, rereading to read faster, your comprehension doesn't improve. In fact, in some cases, actually declines. But if we give students reasons to reread, reasons to answer questions that they might have, or to transform a text into some other form, that's an authentic reason to go, and that will improve comprehension because they're using that brain of ours to make meaning and discover different layers of meaning. So the key is the reason for doing the rereading.
Wonderful. Next question, and this was a really good question. This is when you were doing all of the different word definitions for the English language. You know, so one person asked, should we be avoiding the use of idioms with ELL students because words mean different things in different contexts?
Well, I think that's what happens sometimes in our desire to, you know, I don't know what the right word is, shelter students, you know, so they don't have to deal with these. But you know, the fact of the matter is, we're preparing for our children for the real world. So we do need to. I think these are things that we do need to bring into our instructional setting. And again, in a way that can be fun and engaging, where we ask kids to group those metaphors, those idiomatic expressions. I think we're doing a disservice if we don't give these to our kids. We did an analysis of a couple of state reading exams. You know, the states around here every year give our kids these tests, and what we found is the passages kids are asked to read are filled with idiomatic expressions, figurative language, and they're in some cases ask questions. What did the author mean by this expression? Well, I don't think you're going to be able to answer that question if you haven't had some exposure and practice in these idiomatic expressions there. So truly, I think it's something, but if done in a way that can be fun and engaging, like I hope you saw today, where we group them around a theme, or perhaps we even ask kids to use them in their own written language, as the summary to Romeo and Juliet came across, using those sports idioms. That's the kind of fun stuff I think kids enjoy doing, because they are being creative. They're doing something that they find valuable themselves. I'll be honest with you, it'll really knock your socks off when you see them doing that. I had to use my own favorite idiom there.
Yeah, that was great.
It's amazing how often we just embed these into our language, don't we? We don't even know we're using them half the time.
That's true. That was very true. Very true. There's another question, same topic. Is there a printout of the baseball idiom and Romeo and Juliet? Do you have some sort of additional handout you could share with the attendees?
Let me see.
Other than the PowerPoint, we'll be sharing the PowerPoint slides as PDF file.
Well, yeah, and rather than getting a million emails from people, can I put something together maybe and send it to you, Carrie, and you could post it on the website?
Yep.
Okay. Maybe try something like that.
Yeah.
So give me several days, and I'll send something to you.
Okay. Sounds good. Here's a really good question. How many times are you supposed to read, or how many times does a child need to read a certain text until comprehension of that text occurs?
Well, Great question. I don't think we can, as many times as you need is what I would say. It's for your purposes. I read a text once, and I can say I understand it. But if I read it a second, third time, I'm probably going to get more out of it. So, I guess it depends on how we define comprehension. How deeply do we want kids to understand something? Generally speaking, people who have written about fluency often say that, at least for developing fluency, about 4 rereadings is usually enough to get students to a point where they're fluent and meaningful in the reading. But again, I kind of hesitate to giving a number like that, because then, it can easily be interpreted as saying, oh, that's all we need to do. Sometimes I need to read something 5 or 6 times. Sometimes I can skim it, and I'll have a sufficient comprehension for my purposes. So I hate to, give you a kind of a not specific answer, but it is something that actually does vary here. I'm looking at the comments here, by the way, and I noticed that Diana, who's a native Italian speaker, gave me a little bit of information about antipasta or there. So, she just got erased there. Anyways, thank you, Diana. I appreciate that.
Wonderful. The next question is, can you send the title and ISBN number of your book? Can you send that over to me?
Oh, yeah, I'll do that. Oh, sure, absolutely.
Okay. I've got to make sure we make a note of that. Let's see here. This person says, I encourage my students to try to read as quickly as possible. Is that bad? That's an interesting question.
I don't want to say it's bad, but here's the way I approach it. I want kids to be fast readers. I really do. Because the research shows that there's a strong correlation between speed of reading and reading comprehension. My dissertation study over 30 years ago was on this. But here's what I want. I want kids to become fast the way all of us became fast. I'm a reasonably fast reader, and I'm sure that all of you out there are reasonably fast as well. But do you remember your teacher ever doing, explicit instruction in trying to read faster than the day before? Maybe there was a little bit of that, but what really made us fast readers was we just read a lot in authentic sorts of ways. So, I would recommend not overemphasizing the speed. I know there are some kids who really do read in an excessively slow way, and we'd want to help them. But you know how you help them develop speed is what we just talked about today. Assisted reading, when I read something with a partner and that partner is reading slightly faster than I am, I'm going to have to increase my speed slightly. Or when I read something several times through, without even anybody telling me to improve my speed, I'm going to naturally become a faster reader. So I don't think it's something we have to really spend too much emphasis on. The focus should be on authentic, meaningful reading. The speed will come along quite naturally with that.
Okay, so we've got time for one more question here.
Good, because I'm running out of gas. Here's another idiom. I'm running out of gas.
That's cute. Okay, so one more question. Is the close reading procedure that you've been talking about a reliable way to improve comprehension?
Oh, yeah. I think it's, if you think, now I'm starting to babble here, but, you go back to our own ways of comprehending. As adults here, we read something once, and if it's a pretty challenging text, or what does the Common Core call it, complex text, our first reading of it often is not is not as deep as it needs to be, and so we'll have to go back through it. And doing that regularly as a practice, we develop certain, protocols that we will use throughout the rest of our lives when we come to those complex texts. I sometimes will read a opinion piece in our local newspaper, and I at first, without looking at the author, I'll read it for the information that was given. I'll try to evaluate the article, but then I'll start looking at it again. I'm asking myself, well, is this guy a Democrat or a Republican? What sort of agenda did he have? That sort of thing. So when I go back to it over and over again, it's just a natural protocol that I've developed for my own reading when I really want to get deeply into a text like that. I'm sure that with the presidential election coming up here the next several months here, we're going to be doing a lot of deep reading, or close reading, I would say, of what our candidates have to say. Why? Because we want to select the best person to lead our country for the next 4 years.
Correct. Okay. Well, that was wonderful, Dr. Rasinski. It was really entertaining and fun to listen to, and I hope all of our attendees really enjoyed it. So the next steps here are any additional questions that we did not get to, please email us at webinars@scilearn.com. As soon as I shut the meeting off, it will go to a post-survey page where you can let us know what you thought of the webinar, but you can also download a certificate of attendance along with the PDF file of the presentation slides. So again, I want to thank Dr. Rasinski for such a great presentation today. I hope you really all enjoyed it, and I'll see you online again sometime soon. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.